Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is Gidon Bromberg, who is Israeli director of the nonprofit organization EcoPeace Middle East. Gidon is also a friend of the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security program, and his work was the focus of a recent article in the Wilson Quarterly titled Sea, Sun, and Peace, in the issue that was titled Water in a World of Conflict. Gidon, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, a real pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. Before we dig into some discussion of your organization, I want you to straighten out the hierarchy for me. I introduced you as the Israeli director because you have a unique structure on the management side. Could you explain?
We very much do. We're in fact the only regional organization that exists in any field that includes Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis together. So our organization is managed on a day-to-day basis by myself as the Israeli director, Nada Majdalani, our Palestinian director, and Yana Abu Taleb, our Jordanian director. So we work out of 3 offices in Tel Aviv, in Ramallah, and in Amman, and we bring together about 60 staff, with every staff person having their counterpart in the other office, working together for the same common cause.
And you've been doing this since 1994?
25 years, yes. We're going to be celebrating 25 years.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you, at the end of December.
Yeah. So, not to be stereotypical about this, but in a region that too often makes the headlines based on conflict, what you've been doing is really sort of a shining example of what's possible.
So, without lightening it in any way, it's tremendously challenging, but absolutely yes. We bring together the common concern related to our shared environment, and particularly our scarce water resources, as an issue that requires cooperation.
Nature doesn't care about borders.
So nature respects no borders, nature knows no borders, as the saying goes. But it's real on the ground. So in a part of the world where water scarcity is prevalent. The Middle East is the most water scarce part of the world, where when you turn on the tap, you don't always expect to see water. In fact, for most of our region, water is intermittently supplied. It can flow from the municipality taps once a week, once a month, once every 3 months, depending on the community, depending on the country. And that means that your people need to live with a very different water reality of storing water as much as they can when water is flowing, and then be very, very efficient in the conservation of that scarce water resources. No one dies of thirst. They can always buy additional tanker water, but the quality of that water is sometimes in doubt, and the cost can be 25 to 30% of your income. So it's a real burden. So when we talk about water, we talk about very serious needs of hundreds of millions of people who live under extreme conditions of water scarcity.
Now, water is sort of like air in that when we have it, we don't think much about it. But when it's scarce, suddenly we acutely become aware of that problem. So what are the things that people don't consider when they consider, I don't know, what would be the jargon? Is it water security? How do you describe it?
So, people consider, the issue at different levels according to their own particular circumstances. So at the community level, people will think twice about showering every day when they live in water scarcity. That's a given. At the community, at the national level, the issue is planning. The issue is how can we plan for a future with rising population, high population growths, refugee intake in the surrounding countries, particularly Jordan, which in these last years has received close to 2 million refugees from Syria. How do you plan with those difficult circumstances when you're also facing increased water scarcity because of climate change? Now, in some parts of the world, such as here in North America, climate change is a divisive issue. There are climate skeptics. In the Middle East, that's not the case at all. if there's one thing that the three governments that we work with, Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian, can agree on, is that climate change is very real. We have witnessed some 15 years of drought in the last 20 years. The Sea of Galilee, this iconic lake that every child on earth has heard about, reached the black line last summer. That means that the freshwater lake was so low that it could have become a saline lake. Two islands appeared in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. So historically low levels of participation of rainfall that have further exacerbated the water scarcity that people have to deal with. Climate change is truly seen as a threat multiplier in our region. It's not only having to cope with less water, it's also having to cope with increased temperatures that threaten the very viability of continuing to live in parts of the Middle East, where temperatures, rising to the high 40s over consecutive months become dangerous to continue to survive in such climatic conditions.
Well, we should mention that you are in Washington, D.C. in October, and our heat index today is 97 or something. Crisp, clear fall weather, not. So the political barrier you talk about to action, if you look at public opinion polls, it doesn't seem to exist anymore. It seems to be a problem of the elected class, that American politicians of a certain sort are the ones who are driving this denialism, or whatever you want to call it. How much of a barrier is this to you in making progress on the things you're working on?
So the politics and the policy issues are the real barrier in our case as well, but it's coming from a different perspective. It's coming from the conflict. It's coming from a lack
inability to work together, not denial of the problem that needs to be solved.
Exactly. No denial of climate change, but a inability and a fear, a distrust of working together. So at EcoPeace, we've actually put on the table a proposition that we think is a game changer. On the one hand, Jordan has vast desert areas. Jordan has the comparative advantage to produce photovoltaic solar energy. It's already a regional leader, and it will meet its Paris commitments of 20% renewables in time by 2020.
Lots of sun, lots of places for solar farms.
330 days of sunshine, vast desert areas, low environmental value of those desert areas, and therefore 1% of Jordan's territory can provide 20% of electricity needs of Jordan, Palestine, and Israel together. On the other hand, the Mediterranean coast of Israel-Palestine, Israel-Gaza, has the comparative advantage of being able to desalinate seawater. With the advance of technology and membrane technology, the cost of desalination has plummeted from $2 a cubic meter to just 50 cents in the last 7-8 years. Israel is already a world leader in having 5 of the 10 largest desalination plants in the world on its Mediterranean coast. The Mediterranean is 100 kilometers from all of our population centers, and therefore we can move water relatively cheaply if indeed we increase our desalination and trade. And that's the key. The key is to Israel and Palestine to buy solar electricity from Jordan, use that solar energy to desalinate on the Mediterranean, increase the water pie, and sell back water to Jordan. The challenge, of course, is the politics. The countries don't trust each other. We continue to have failed to reach an agreement a political agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, where Israel continues to control so much still of the West Bank.
What you describe almost sounds like a deal too good to turn down, no matter what the other circumstances are. I think of I interviewed one of our scholars recently about his research on U.S.-Soviet cooperation during the Cold War on nuclear weapons. So even though rhetorically these were opponents, even enemies, they found a way to work together on something that was mutually important? Is that possibility in place?
So at EcoPeace, we're all about first educating the general public and decision makers, and through that helping to create the political will to see that cooperation take place. So with the support of a German foundation, we've prepared a pre-feasibility study that shows the environmental, economic, and geopolitical advantages of moving forward on this water energy swap. We've interested the private sector from all three countries to be involved, because both renewable energy and desalination are a profitable concern. They're led today by the private sector because the technology is ripe.
Ripe for entrepreneurs to invest in this.
Completely. From the region and internationally, including from the United States. We've led a delegation of government decision makers, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli, together to speak about the project in the European Parliament, in the German Bundestag. So we've seen some progress.
Do you have champions in place who are in elected office who are willing to advocate for this plan?
Absolutely. We have ministers, we have departmental heads, we have opinion makers that are with us from all levels, from the environmental side, from the security side. And from the security side is a very interesting, powerful means of bringing decision makers together, because what we highlight is that climate change is not just a development issue, it's a security concern. It's no longer enough, and this is something that I got to highlight at the UN Climate Summit last week, was that it's no longer good enough to feel secure on climate adaptation in your own country if your neighboring country is failing. Because as Syria has shown the broader Middle East, when one neighbor fails to deal with climate change, and in Syria you had hundreds of thousands of farmers leave their land because the government failed to respond to climate change. The same drought period hit southern Syria, northern Israel, and northern Jordan. The difference is that Israel and Jordan responded to the needs of farmers. Assad failed to do so. And although it's not the direct cause, it was a contributing cause to the uprising. Now, that uprising didn't just leave devastation in Syria. It meant millions of refugees walking into Jordan. Jordan was already water scarce. Amman, its capital, was receiving water before the Syrian crisis just twice a week. After the Syrian crisis, water is cut by 50%. There are areas of the capital that get water only 12 hours a week to 24 hours a week. And given that level of water scarcity, that in itself leads to anger, animosity, that further destabilizes an already difficult government.
Are there projections for when, if current trends continue, they would reach a water zero circumstance?
Well, we're running out of natural water. We're today consuming over 300 million cubic meters of water that we don't have. We're mining our groundwater to a level that we risk damaging that groundwater to become saline and then therefore no longer usable. A case in point is Gaza.
Is there a timeline? I mean, I don't want to be melodramatic, but the clock is ticking is what I'm hearing.
The clock is very much ticking, and a lot depends on what is going to be the impact of climate change. What we're seeing is a greater impact than the models had originally predicted. The models had predicted
all the bad things are happening much more quickly.
Much more quickly. That we were told that we're going to see a 20% reduction in precipitation by the end of the century. Now we're already seeing a 20-25% reduction in precipitation today, and we're talking about a 40% reduction in precipitation by the end of the century today. We're seeing models are today showing a 50% increase in the summer months. That means that again, temperatures become unlivable for so much longer of the year. That has real implications not only for water supply but for food production. and that's another contributing multiplier impact.
Insects, diseases, it never stops.
Exactly.
Well, at the you mentioned the UN Climate Summit. What would be your report on the general mood of things and of nations? And are you optimistic about? We were joking before we began recording that the alternative to being an optimist is so dark that you choose to be an optimist. Why not? But can you gauge the circumstance for us?
So my concern at the workshop that was held on climate and security that I was invited to speak to was that I was mostly speaking to the convinced, that the people in the room were all nodding their heads, that the governments that were there were the friends of climate and security, and those that are still in denial were not in the room, were not listening. And that's what scares me about the politics of today, this reluctance to hear another narrative, this refusal to look at the science, hard science of 99% of the world's scientists, and keep our head in the sand. We see that, of course, in the Middle East, in the continued conflict that we see over land and water. And our role at EcoPeace is to literally pull people's head out of the sand. And we can do that very effectively because the climate crisis and the water crisis is very visual. And I want to give an example. I mentioned the overdrawing of the aquifers. Well, the case in point is Gaza. There are 2 million people living in Gaza where the groundwater has reached, not the red line, but the black line. 99% of the water is no longer potable. The aquifer is so overdrawn that seawater, because Gaza's on the Mediterranean Sea, is literally flowing in. Because of conflict between Israel and Hamas, Israel adopted a policy of not allowing cement to come into Gaza because Hamas was stealing cement to build tunnels that were being used to attack. We brought attention to the issue that, well, without cement, sewage treatment plants can't be built in Gaza, and therefore raw sewage is flowing from Gaza into the Mediterranean and risking livelihood in Gaza and in Israel. We started testing the beaches of Israel just north of Gaza looking for cholera, because we knew that if we can show the lose-lose, policies would change. Cement, we could change the policy and allow cement to come in so the sewage treatment plants could be built. Luckily, we didn't find cholera, but we found out that one of Israel's desalination plants, 7 kilometers north of Gaza, was being intermittently closed because the sewage flowing out of Gaza was naturally being carried north by the currents, closing the desalination plant. With the release of that information, we were able to completely change the narrative because we were able to highlight to decision makers on all sides that you can't disengage from a shared environment. That when, again, your neighbor fails, for whatever reason, whether you like it or not, it's going to impact your own security, your own the health and safety of your own population. And in this case, the closure of Ashkelon means the closure of 15% of Israel's drinking water. So that's a very serious water security concern.
If anyone was wondering what you meant by threat multiplier, they just need to listen to that again. It just keeps cascading. So you mentioned essentially preaching to the choir at the UN Climate Summit. Other than the U.S. president, who famously or infamously, depending on where you stand on the issue, is a climate denier, are there other nations that need to come to the table who aren't currently there?
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, it's the Northern Europeans that are around the table, and then a few other. We need the G77 in the table together with China. We need Russia to be around the table. I describe it. In fact, my Palestinian director describes it as the Titanic. Some of us are up there in first class. The majority of the population is perhaps underneath in the lower parts of the boat, but those that are in first class will suffer the same fate.
You're all headed to the same iceberg.
Exactly, and nothing will stop the Titanic from sinking. So whether we feel comfortable or whether we feel uncomfortable, we have to accept the science. And the science tells us that this is a serious security concern. And that requires that we all come on board. I think that there's many other forums where this type of issue, needs to be brought to the forefront. The UN Security Council. Climate security needs to become an issue of the Security Council. The Munich Security Summit that takes place in Munich every year. This is an issue that
We're not just talking about nuclear weapons at these.
No. This is our modern nuclear weapon.
You're going to, I know, as part of your U.S. trip, the Environmental Peace Conference. And so how much has this now become part of the consciousness of the way nations think, that the environment is a security issue, is a peace issue, potential for peace building, but also a potential for conflict? And what is this conference, and what does it hope to achieve?
So this is the very first time. This is a new organization that was just created, and the Wilson Center is a founding member of this association to place environmental peace building on the map. Everyone talks about water wars and how the environment is demised and can be a source of conflict. But the other side of the coin is that because of the basic needs, issues involved in water, involved in the environment, it's more often than not the impetus for cooperation. Because it's an issue of necessity, countries come together to cooperate over water. And there's tremendous amount of research showing that it's rare that countries actually go to war. There's lots of rhetoric, lots of language threatening war. But the evidence shows that countries will come together over water scarcity issues, over shared water threats. But it doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. It requires leadership. Where there are water agreements in place on transboundary water issues, you see almost no conflict, no violent conflicts breaking out. And that requires leadership. That requires placing these issues on the political agenda. That's exactly the role that we seek to play at EcoPeace Middle East for the Middle East region. I know that also here at the Wilson Center. We can turn this conversation around to a conversation of lose-lose, to a conversation of win-win. And that's exactly what our proposition of the sun and the sea for peacemaking is all about.
Well, while I appreciate that note of optimism, I always feel when we have a conversation like this, whoever the we is, in this case you and I, that people watching who care and who don't need to be convinced about the nature of the threat will feel hopeless and helpless because of the enormity of the problem. What do you say to them? What can individuals do?
So, I work in the most difficult, intractable conflict in the world, I think. 100 years of conflict. And despite that, we've seen real progress on the ground. I had a minister say to me, Gidon, show me your palm. When hair grows on your palm, that's when fresh water would flow down the River Jordan again. Because water is scarce, there was tremendous competition over natural water resources. Israel, Jordan, Syria took all the water of the River Jordan and used it for legitimate purposes, but left nothing in the river. Well, the community advocacy that we led, working with schools, creating youth water trustees, Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, over 15 years of activism, producing reports, producing the first integrated master plan for the Jordan Valley that showed that cooperation over the shared water resources of the Jordan can bring economic benefits, can lift people out of poverty for all communities around the Jordan. Events such as the Big Jump, where we've had mayors, again, Palestinian, Jordanian, Israeli, jump into clean stretches of the Jordan River together, despite the fact that the next day they knew that they would be condemned for jumping, for being seen with the enemy. Through that type of research, activism, education, we've seen over $100 million of investments to get sewage out of the River Jordan. We've seen for the first time in 49 years water being released again from the Sea of Galilee to the lower Jordan. No hair on my palm, but even in the midst of drought, that water today continues to flow, because now there's a common understanding that the Jordan River is valuable. It's not only a river holy to half of humanity, but it's valuable to the peoples that live along its banks for their own health, for their own economy, and as a means to build trust between our communities.
Gidon Bromberg, thank you not just for the information, but also for the inspiration. We need that too. And speaking of the former, where can people get more information about EcoPeace Middle East?
So people can Google our website at ecopeaceme.org. We have Facebook, English, Arabic, Hebrew. We have a monthly newsletter. All of our reports are PDFs on our website. We certainly encourage people to engage with us in the conversation around environmental peace building.
Great. Well, again, thank you for fighting the good fight, and I hope you continue to do so. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Wonderful being here.
In addition to thanking Gidon Bromberg, I want to thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again for a future episode. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.